Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're joining us. We've just had a fascinating 3 hours or so with Palo Alto Networks, with Jason, and a couple of members from our siberXchange advisory. We learned various elements of how remote work has been impacted as a result of the pandemic. We looked at strategies, we looked at tools, we looked at technology, people, and processes. But I want to take you back for a moment when you're that person in the room. What do I mean by that person? How many times, when you're leading teams or working with a whole bunch of teams, have you brought up the question of what if? What if, for example, our platform goes down? What if Ali cannot make it into work that day and we're unable to run our scripts? What if traffic routes to our offices are shut down? How do we come into the office? Constantly painting that doomsday scenario. And often you get told, or at least I've been told, you're overthinking it. Overthinking, also known as the superpower of looking or finding a problem when one doesn't exist. However, I think the pandemic and the crisis we've been struck into has got us to rethink about that person or that Ali who's overthinking. As you've seen, the stats were telling us that many companies that have been unable to bring back their infrastructure in a remote environment lose roughly approximately $100,000 per hour. Factor in lost revenue, factor in added costs, factor in time being spent, that's a lot of money. But not only is it about the money, if you're running critical infrastructure, in healthcare, for example, as we discussed yesterday, downtime and the inability to bring back service to that continuity can represent a life and death situation. My guests today are individuals who help organizations prevent those kind of environments from happening. I wouldn't call them overthinkers, I would call them critical thinkers, who, as every C-suite in security does, and good folks in security do, is that they help prevent a problem from becoming an emergency. Thank you to my siberXchange advisory champions for joining me today. I thank you for not only being a part of our siberXchange advisory, but also supporting in this new initiative launched by siberX alongside the town of Ajax. I'm here in the beautiful studio here at St. Francis Center, which is also located on the land of the people of the Mississaugas of the Scugog Island First Nation. And my advisory champions today are folks that not only I have been engaging with in a variety of environments, but folks that I look up to as mentors who have a lot of experience that we can all learn from. I'm going to let them introduce themselves by singling each one of them and have them take the next minute or so to talk a little bit about what they do and what their perspectives are. Sarah, let's begin with you. A quick introduction, first name, where are you working, and what brings you to the siberXchange?
Sorry, I think I was on mute.
Yes, you were. Somebody had to do it, and it was Sarah. Well done. Let's move on. Go ahead, Sarah. We can hear you just fine.
Again, Ali? Sorry.
Yeah, just if you can rewind back to 10 seconds.
Absolutely. I'm Sarah Qureshi, founder of QSI Security. Right now, I'm working from home. Actually, I'm supporting a company that is based out of California. I've been working with them since the beginning of March, when the whole pandemic started, and my default work mode is actually working from home quite a bit of the time.
Fantastic. And I want to go to that word default, because security by default and remote by default are two philosophical but also operational concepts that we're going to talk about when we're discussing business continuity. Mr. Castro, let's take it over to you. A quick introduction and what brings you to siberXchange.
Ali, thanks so much. And welcome to everyone. Michael Castro, I am founder of RiskAware Cyber. 25 years in the cyber business, but most recently with RiskAware as a consultant, as a mentor, and helping small, medium businesses through their journeys with cybersecurity.
Fantastic. And I really am looking forward to discussing further on the aspect of your mentorship, especially because of the fact that you've been sort of upfront and had front row seats with not just large enterprise, but small businesses as well. And I think there'll be a little bit for everyone as we go through the discussion in the next 55 minutes. And last but not the least, all the way from the United States, Janet, who was my guest on the Power Hour, one of the most well-liked and well-viewed Power Hour sessions. Janet, a quick introduction and what brings you to the siberXchange.
Yes, I'm Janet Tsai. Thanks so much, Ali, for having me here. So I've been in the IT industry, in the IT department in the aerospace defense industry for over 20 plus years. And about 2.5 months ago with the COVID-19, been working from home for about 2.5 months. And then now I'm back in the office 3 times a week and then twice at home. And I've been doing disaster recovery to business continuity planning, vulnerability scanning, about 3 years, but I did all sorts of IT-related, project management-related issues, and it is my pleasure to be here to share about business continuity with everybody today. Back to you, Ali.
Thank you so much. So the goal for today is to talk about the 3 roadblocks for business continuity. And I've got a couple of them in mind, and we'll sort of piece through all of them and then go into the last 10 minutes with some questions. Once again, a big thank you to the siberXchange team for making the experience very seamless. Firstly, I want to delve into what do we mean by business continuity. You know, I've often said this to the various companies that I work with at Durham College, is that whatever we're doing, for example, as you all know, I work in both AI and cybersecurity. I always say that these are not, whatever we're dealing with are not problems to be solved, but realities we need to experience. We need to place ourselves in certain situations. I would say that pandemic planning and the pandemic situation is one that it was extremely difficult for us to envision what would that look like. And I want to come to that as the first roadblock. But before I give us or sort of crash us into our first few roadblocks, I want to turn it over to my panelists to talk to us about what does business continuity mean to you? There are different definitions for it, no single dictionary definition. I'm going to start off with where we ended off, and I'll go to Janet first. Janet, in your perspective, what is business continuity?
Yes, business continuity is basically the ability to be able to continue your business no matter what kind of pandemic you're in. You have to have lots of planning ahead and able to continue your business no matter what. That is really my definition.
No matter what. We're going to pack that, or unpack that rather, in our first roadblock. I'll turn it over to Michael Castro. Michael, in your perspective, your 2 rupees on what do we mean by business continuity?
I think, quite honestly, the name says it all, right? It's the ability for the business to continue. It goes beyond IT. It's a thought of a whole organization being able to overcome a challenge that is put upon them to be able to continue to grow, continue to serve, continue to make money, and continue to prosper.
Thank you for that. Continue to make money and prosper, and we'll work with that as well as we look at the financial roadblocks to business continuity. We saw Sarah taking down ferociously some notes. Are you going to contradict what your fellow panelists said, or are you going to add on to that, or are you just going to say whatever they said?
So I'm quite selfish. What I do is I only hear every problem in terms of cybersecurity problems. So my response is going to be a company's ability to continue to identify, monitor, detect, and mitigate the security risks that keep coming up as the world is changing. That, to me, is part of business continuity from my perspective.
Right. Fantastic. So we've heard quite a few things here. We've heard business continuity from a prosperity and a financial perspective. We've heard business continuity from the aspect of staying or keeping the lights on no matter what. And we've heard about business continuity that is discussed through security and safety. So you've heard proactive measures, but you've also heard how do you measure the return on good and sound business continuity plans. Now I want to jump into the first roadblock. And I know there are multiple, but our job here today is to really get to 3 roadblocks that we feel are prevalent today. And these may not hold true tomorrow, but for today, as we sit right now on August 11th, let's come down to 3 major roadblocks that we can detect. You know, my dad always tells me that, and depending on what school of thought you subscribe to or do not, that when Noah was building the ark, it wasn't raining. You have to prepare for all of those situations. Would you agree that one of the most challenging aspects of business continuity planning is our own complacency as people? We don't necessarily imagine the what ifs. We don't think about what pandemics, well, we never really were speaking a lot about it. We ignore a lot of those information. Do you think that the first roadblock is us as people and how we understand or become complacent in our normal 9 to 5s? We'll start off with Sarah. Your thoughts?
Right. So as people, I find that we hope for the best. But as cybersecurity SME, I think I'm always with the mindset of preparing for the worst.
Correct.
So that's where my mindset is, essentially, pretty much all the time, no matter what the context. Hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And for that, you've got to actually actively put on your negative hat and think of all the ways something can go wrong, and then make sure you put all the controls in place so when it happens, you're prepared proactively to handle that scenario.
Right. Ultimately, when we're dealing with people, Sarah, and we'll keep the conversation with you before we go to our other panelists, you're dealing with a variety of stakeholders. You're not just dealing with the IT folks, you're dealing with your auditors, you're dealing with the operational folks, etc. That can be very challenging when a security individual, such as yourself, at the helm of all things security and making a business continuity plan, that can be quite challenging to get all the various stakeholders to the table and get them to envision work in a different environment. How do you tackle some of those challenges?
Right, so that's a great question. I never think everything from the context or from the lens of security. I think about a business from the context of business growth itself, business context first, and security second. It is an integral part, but what I always think about is everybody has their own good intentions on the table to make a company successful from their perspective, whether it's the risk management team, cybersecurity team, IT infrastructure team, so on and so forth. So you can't just sit in a silo. It's a very collaborative way of thinking to be open-minded about what else can be done from another person's or another department's perspective to feed into a very collaborative and comprehensive business continuity plan. It's never done in isolation because a business is not conducted in isolation. So that's the principle and the underlying thought process that I basically invoke.
Thank you. And I know I've been looking at the business from the inside. I'm going to go to Michael and then we'll go to Janet. But I think, Janet, the question that I asked to Michael will sort of have some similarities with what I'll come to you with. But Michael, would you agree? And, staying in truth with this idea of people at the core of what we do, it's not just the people within our organization. You have to start thinking about those receiving your services and those individuals who are basically patrons of whatever services that you're providing and are subscribing to it financially, so on and so forth. How much of a challenge is it to understand when you make a business continuity plan to factor in the experience of the end customer, especially with security top of mind?
Yeah, so I mean, businesses obviously as themselves will be impacted by some event or something going on, much like this pandemic. And so a lot of organizations worry about themselves first. They put their own people first, and they have to deal with the challenges of being the organization that they are. But depending on the business that you're in, really impacts and affects then what you're able to do for those for which you are in business for. And those can be customers that feed into a social platform. Those could be e-commerce. Those could be people for which you have to deliver a product. And if that product can't be provided, that product or service, that can be a rippling effect down the line as well from a continuity perspective. You think of an organization that, for instance, manufactures a key component for another piece. Even with looking at things like face shields today. Yeah. If the organization that creates the elastic headband is unable to perform their business and has to take a break, well, that has an effect down the line in the ability of the organization that manufactures the face shield to be able to put together their whole piece. So I think it's inherent when one has a business continuity plan, of course, to put their organization first and their people first, but there has to be some thought into what is that impact? What is the rolling effect of, our potentially, our organization's lack of continuity or delayed continuity? What's the effect down the hill in terms of the effect on other companies and their continuity?
Fantastic. And I want to work with that just a little bit and turn it to Janet. And again, staying true to understanding how much of a roadblock do people and personalities bring when you are preparing a business continuity plan. Now, we've spoke about it during the Power Hour, Janet, you and I, that auditing, which is at the core of what you do, is basically the process wherein you make sure that a particular business operation and a business function as a whole is staying true to a particular framework. All well and good. You are responsible for making sure, not in a punitive way, but in a supportive, collaborative way, that we're staying true to all of our frameworks. Is it fair for me to make the statement that sometimes our inability to be agile, especially with our frameworks, really represents one of the biggest business continuity roadblocks? Because in this pandemic, and I think you would agree with me, we've kind of had to deviate away from the norm and at sometimes color outside of the lines of the frameworks. Your thoughts, Janet?
Yes, thanks for that, Ali. I have to completely agree with you. You definitely have to be agile and flexible. You do have a business continuity plan, but depending on the disaster or pandemic you're dealing with, it might not sometimes align to it completely. And that's where you need to be creative in terms of what kind of frameworks that you are building. And sometimes it's also a lack of training among your employees to be aware of what's going on. As you were mentioning about being complacent, you always have to be on guard to figure out what are you going to be facing the next few months. I mean, obviously right now, given the COVID-19, you're already aware. I mean, it's already August. It might be a bit more longer. So what are you going to do about it? And you got to think about risk assessment. What are some of your critical business that needs to continue or that you might need to drop? Those are just some of the decision making. You need to work with your senior management to determine the top 3 critical businesses that you need to maintain right away, and where are you going to get the budget to maintain that. That's one aspect of the business side. And there's also the technology side of aspect where the IT involved, hardware, software, all your employee may be remote. Where are you going to get the budget to get everybody set up? So those are some of the things you're going to have to move around, being agile, flexible. And I know there's going to be budget constraint, but those some of the decisions that the upper management would need to make among all the staff to determine top 3 critical businesses to continue, and how are you going to support that?
And you mentioned senior management, right? And I've always held this belief that diversity of perspective really allows us to look at the same thing from a different perspective at all times. So different views on one particular phenomena. Which brings me to a question that came up yesterday when I was discussing risk and risk management with some folks from the Africa Cyber Defense League. And it was this aspect of people and responsibility. Right now, who, in your opinion, is the person that is in charge of that business continuity plan? I know it's fair to say, ideally, democratically, we're all a part of this journey, but somebody has to own it. In your perspective, does that fall in the perimeter of the security leads? Or do we actually, in light of what we've learned from the pandemic, actually need to have basically a dedicated role that is targeted at business continuity? Michael, we'll start off with you and then go to Sarah and back to Janet. Michael?
So, cyber definitely has a piece in business continuity plan.
Yeah.
Should it live in that group? Probably not. Because, really, when we look at a BCP or, those type of events that are causing an invoke of the business continuity plan, there's so much inside an organization that is impacted from that. I definitely think, though, that there needs to be, and I think, what we've seen over the last many months has really started to show that for some organizations. There needs to be somebody with the authority, with the role to ensure not only the plan is created, but the plan is updated, the plan is maintained, the plan is tested, and the plan can be activated and run as required. In the end, I think for organizations, especially larger ones, the true ownership comes from the top. It has to be a model that is from the top down to ensure that every part of that organization is represented, and every part of that organization fills in their piece to ensure the overall viability.
Thank you for that. Now, I haven't tested it, but people tell me that a fish rots from the head down, and I completely subscribe with you in the idea that when you have buy-in from senior management, like Janet had alluded to, that ultimately allows you to get the buy-in from the rest of the folks and to basically set the right behavior and patterns. Let's work with that just a little bit, because you used a word there called activated. And Janet, I want to come to you and come to Sarah as well with the same question. This term of activating the business continuity plan, inherent within it is this idea that now people have to take on roles and resources, or basically functions that previously they may not have. Let's give you an example. Yesterday we had the mayor from the town of Ajax, the beautiful town that we're hosting you from, and he mentioned that as part of their business continuity plan was to look at where would they be losing financial resources and how could they use their existing resources to cover other functions. So he gave us the example of, since our rec facilities were closed, we were losing income from rentals. Since taxpayers were suffering in terms of financial stress. They had deferments on their tax payments, two major areas of revenue. So what they did was those people who were supposed to be working in the rec areas, instead they redeployed them to do some other functions like grass cutting or whatever else have you. Functions that were similar to the skill set that they have, but not necessarily what they had signed up for originally. How do you then ensure that people are ready to activate something which is really different from what they're used to? Janet?
Yeah, so Ali, that's a great question, and it definitely that requires planning and being prepared and making sure your employees are aware and being trained for a situation like this. So just to give an example, we have those folks that are in manufacturing shop, you actually have to be present in order to manufacture products. So what are you going to do during this COVID-19 pandemic? Not everybody can be there. You need to keep 6 feet distance apart. What are you going to do? You're going to stop shop? I don't think so. So you're going to have to be creative and coming up with the backup plan to what to do. So in this situation, we would rotate the employees because they need to continue to work, and perhaps fewer folks go on a certain day. I guess on a rotation basis, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, particular folks go in, Tuesday, Thursday, another set of folks go in, so that they're all still pitching in. And in the meantime, the days that they're not going in, take a look at their skill set and ask each of them, tell me what else your strengths are. What are some of the skill set you can still help during this pandemic besides your current job? On the days that you cannot be in the office, can you think of some areas that you can help out? And I would say come up with a list of items that your company are in need of and see which employees can volunteer to help in that aspect. And it's a team effort. It can't just be one person, I would say. There is a lead person to help taking on the business community effort, but it takes teamwork to chip in. Everybody's got a major player and everybody's got to help out in order to get past this pandemic and continue with the business.
Fantastic. And this aspect of communications is probably one roadblock that we will come to towards the end. And I just want to have the final say on the people roadblock piece and come back to Sarah and sort of pair this back with communications. Sarah, this is extremely challenging that you have to have a plan in place where you not only need to assume in many cases or preemptively tell yourself, what the possible threats rather could be, what the possible scenarios may be to activate a business continuity environment. As a CISO or as somebody at the forefront of all things security and all things business continuity, how do you manage then to keep yourself informed of two things? Number one, what's going on in the business from every area, and number two, what's happening around you? Because your portfolio as an individual doesn't just focus on business continuity. You have other things to ensure of, from threat intelligence, from disaster recovery, and all other things that you have to look at. How do you keep yourself relevant and informed and timely?
Right. So I'm going to take a step back, Ali. Yeah. You talked about what's the value of having a dedicated business continuity person or a department in a company, and how can everybody feed into it? Cybersecurity is only one contributor to creating a very comprehensive business continuity plan. That's, in my experience, companies that have done really well in that area, there is a dedicated department or a resource that works with everybody in the company to make sure for multiple scenarios. The trouble is, we did not prepare for a scenario where we had to keep the employees away from each other. We kind of thought about the scenario where we will just take the employees from place A and put them in place B, move the critical infrastructure from our live to our disaster recovery places, and that would be it. That's not the case today. So the business continuity plan had to be modified at the last minute to say, okay, now we've got to keep the employees away from each other. Right. The people, such as in the mining industry, it is difficult to create that distance because it's already a confined space. There's many other manufacturing facilities that are not able to easily implement that distance. So they had to modify their business continuity plan on the go as a last minute thing. But they have done it. They've learned how to do it. And the easiest business continuity plan implementation was in the IT sector, where people did not have to be hands-on with anything. Right. So remote workers who were able to work remotely are successfully doing their jobs today. However, the impact is adverse on industries that did not prepare in depth for the scenario where a pandemic would want us to be physically so far away from each other. So that's the current state. Do you want to ask me the second part of your question again in case I didn't answer it?
No, absolutely. And no, you set a very good context with it. I was asking you about how do you stay prepared in the sense that you have to proactively and preemptively detect that something could be coming down the pipeline. How do you ensure that you maintain that relevancy?
Right. So from cybersecurity perspective, the threat landscape has changed altogether.
Yep.
So we are, as an industry, we are looking for that attack that is going to be so comprehensive that is not going to care whether you're working from home, whether you're actually in the premise of a network such as your secure corporate network. Now the attack is pretty much like a level playing field for any attacker to go after a home network, because now they're going to find unprotected corporate assets on unprotected home networks. Right. That's where things are today. So now we're looking at more and more things like, I don't know if you remember when the Cisco routers had published an advisory that people who were plugging in their home network devices with corporate information, sensitive information, right into the router, and it was very easy to discover and steal personal and sensitive information very easily by just about any remote hacker in the world.
Right.
That's where we are today, but it's amplified.
Yep.
So your home network is now doubly your responsibility to secure, even if you have VPN installed, and that is how you connect to the network in your corporate environment.
Right. And I think this aspect of geography and space and mobility is another roadblock that we might sort of come back to towards the end. So thank you for that. I'm going to jump into the next sort of idea around what we mean by a roadblock. But I think it's fair for our audience to really understand and digest that from our panelists, you're hearing that, yes, these roadblocks are there, but you don't necessarily have to look at them from a negative standpoint. Kind of think of it almost as a checkpoint that you come to it. Somebody's put that block there. It's a moment for us to reflect on what are some of these challenges that we need to overcome, or what are some of our needs in order for us to know securely that we can move forward. So don't necessarily think of a roadblock in a negative standpoint. Think positively about, well, who's put this there? Why are we thinking about this? What do we need at this checkpoint? Although I am careful and cautious about checkbox security, this is a good moment to at least get us to think through, if this is a challenge for us, how do we overcome it and continue to overcome it? We'll move on to this aspect of, we understand the importance of people, and it can become a roadblock if we don't value the input from other folks around us and realize how they're functioning and how they're rendering ROI to the corporation. I want to go back to what Sarah said earlier on, was this aspect of geography and mobility. And she brought up the example of Cisco, which inevitably gets us to talk about hardware. There is a heavy reliance, just as we rely on cloud infrastructure. At the end of the day, as the saying goes on Twitter, it's not really a cloud somewhere, it is somebody else's computer. We have a heavy reliance on hardware. Would you agree with me, or let's not necessarily agree with me, but would you understand my perspective when I said, our reliance on hardware really becomes one of the biggest roadblocks to us when it comes to business continuity. For example, in the previous session with Palo Alto, we heard them talk about the idea that overnight, we suddenly had a demand on certain types of laptops, suddenly had a demand on certain types of mobile sets, certain types of devices in order to access certain facilities. We have a heavy reliance on hardware. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the challenges are with hardware and hardware mobility? Janet, we'll start off with you.
Sure. I know one of the challenges in my company experience is really the remote workforce. We had to really ramp up our VPN hardware as it wasn't, the network was slow, basically. We have to ramp that up. And in order to do that, we have to get a new VPN in order to accommodate the capacity of remote workforce that we have. And it's challenging. It is not something you can do overnight. Given the pandemic, everybody is doing the same thing. Everybody is requiring new hardware, and everywhere is requiring that remote workforce to have the ability to be mobile and work anywhere. And given that, you also need to ramp up your security, I would say, especially your cybersecurity force, making sure they're aware of what's going on and the latest hardware that's available. And sometimes it can take months. And what are you going to do about that? You may need to take some other hardware from another location in order to ramp up a particular location at somewhere else. Some of the things to consider is really what kind of hardware you need in order to continue your workforce, to continue your business continuity, and also knowing that it's going to cost you, and what are some of the budget areas that you can take away from and put in your hardware.
Yep. I think this aspect of it's going to cost you will take us to the next roadblock on the financial decisions because you have to pick and choose. You can't necessarily have everything and you have to prioritize. But I do want to take this aspect of the personalization of hardware. And many a times, you'll find folks where you're working in large enterprise, they have a certain standard of the hardware that they want to use. But you and I are familiar with a particular environment, or we are more comfortable using a particular hardware. And so we start to go into that environment of BYOD. Sarah, let's go to you and then we'll go to Michael. From a BYOD perspective, I know we've spoken a lot about this. I know we talk a lot about Internet of Things and all these various devices, but we also know that these can very quickly become the Internet of Threats. From a BYOD perspective, is that still relevant as a business continuity roadblock, or do you feel that we have enough in place to allow for that agnostic kind of approach to hardware?
Right. There is not enough securely configured hardware in the world
Period.
to handle the current response to the pandemic. There really isn't. So we are pressed as an industry, as organizations, we are pressed for time and finances to get people up to speed and get them back as productive as they were before. And there are a lot of compromises that are being made. You mentioned the word standard. In my experience, the implementation of secure configuration settings at the hardware level are dismissed, ignored, unless the company is fully dedicated to making sure that every time they bring in a new piece of hardware, it is secured before and then introduced onto the network. Unfortunately, we let things on the network first, and then we think about assessing them for security, and then we start tightening them. That is quite the reverse way of doing things, but that is a tactical response to things like the current pandemic. So in response to your question about BYOD, it was a nightmare before, it's a nightmare today. If we can somehow make sure that every time we bring in a new node, a new endpoint on the network, it goes through some, at least like basic checks, default security measures, like a baseline security at the very least, that's a step in the right direction.
Talking of baselines, I'm going to turn to Michael. And of course, as security practitioners, you have to, for lack of a better word, hold the fort. You have to make difficult decisions, informed decisions. But in the environment that we're in today, I think Mayor Collier put it brilliantly yesterday where he said, we're building the plane as we fly it. We don't necessarily know what we're getting into. Many business plans today, I think I was talking to Maddie early this morning over coffee, and he said, we don't have an 8-month or a 9-month or 10-month business plan or 1 year. It's 2 weeks at a time. We're having board meetings every 2 weeks to talk about what we're going to be doing for the next 2 weeks. As a security practitioner and somebody that's leading as organizations move more remote and are now sort of in a hyper-hybrid environment, do you think it's a challenge when you have to communicate what you can and cannot use? What are some tips and strategies that you would recommend when making these decisions on what can you use for work and what can't you use for work? Michael?
Yeah, I think that's always been a challenge in the many, many years that, cybersecurity has had, a bit of a say in the way things are done. As practitioners and, especially as seasoned practitioners, we've all seen the cycles of the ability or lack of ability of kind of setting the tone and setting the standards of what, where, and when things are done versus, the carte blanche model that often came about. COVID opened the doors in a lot of ways, and, business continuity was a key phrase that kind of said we have to get things up and running no matter what it's going to take. And, security took a bit of a hit, quite honestly, to make that happen. It is important, and as Sarah and Janet have both said, it is important, though, when we look at a cyber perspective, that there has to be some form of baseline or some form of line that is drawn in the sand that says, our risk will go up tremendously beyond a certain point if we start taking too many shortcuts, if we start cutting the corners, and if we just throw our hands in the air and say, hey, do whatever you want to do, we'll just prepare and become the reactive team. So proactive cyber still has to be there. More and more difficult every day. When we look at devices, when we look at what people are bringing to the table, we try our best to be able to mitigate that through the strategies that we have, through the capabilities. But there is no single pane of glass. There is no single piece of software that we can lay onto all devices in all situations that's going to allow us to feel as secure as cyber practitioners we truly want to feel.
Yesterday, we were also talking about this aspect of vendor management and having that relation and having those frameworks and barometers by which to test whether a particular hardware, a particular product is suited for your environment, not just from an operational perspective, but from a security and a threat perspective. You understand what you're adopting into and buying into. How important or how much has that vendor process changed as a result of the pandemic? Janet, we'll start off with you and then go to Sarah. Janet?
Sure, I would say it definitely has changed. I mean, given, as you guys all know, the shortage of toilet paper, hand sanitizer, I'm sure it shake up the whole entire world about supply chain. Where are you getting your supplies? You might need to consider manufacturing your own products in-house or somewhere nearby versus overseas. So I definitely say it definitely has shaken up everybody. I know for our defense, in terms of Department of Defense, one aspect is they actually have the CMMI. I mentioned about that before on our last power chat, Ali, the capability, capture model, maturity model regarding supply chain, making sure that each supply chain are certified to do business with the DoD and that they are compliant with their cybersecurity aspect of it and things of that in order to do business with the DoD. So that's another aspect of supply chain. But given all, it's just something to think about. How are you going to continue on with the COVID-19 if you're not able to get your products? What are you going to do? And that might not be then part of your business continuity plan, but that's definitely something to add on. And it's a continuous learning experience as well. We don't know what we're going to get thrown at every day, what's the next pandemic, right? But as we continue on, we will be adding that lesson learned and continue to help prepare just to be aware. I think a roadblock, as we were talking about earlier, also the lack of awareness. So we want to make sure that every employee is aware what the situation is and how can we be better and continue to prepare and be aware what sort of disaster will be coming later on.
And I think this aspect of what you just said about seeing for the unseen is really true to now some of the unseen elements that we're seeing with hardware. You've heard me say this before as well, and I think our audience is well familiar, is that I've said, the fundamental difference between the good and the smart practitioner in cybersecurity is the good ones have the sight to say, yep, this is what's before me, and let's act on it. The great ones really have that vision to know what's behind the curtain and what could be coming next. Let's take another 2 minutes to talk about this, what's coming next from a hardware perspective. Sarah, we'll go to you. And this is this aspect of now businesses are now adopting hardware that are heavily laden from an IoT perspective. Yesterday, we spoke a lot about certain organizations have to now measure your temperature when you come in, as an example, to a particular store. But now you're also seeing cases where businesses can only continue if they've got other hardwares in places like plexiglasses, so on and so forth. And there are different ways. I'll give you an example, Sarah. Right now, you're at a store, and this came up with Kat Kood yesterday in her privacy session, where you're at an environment and there's a plexiglass there. You're wearing a mask. It reduces your ability to be heard. I know thanks to the gifts of technology, you can hear me better, but in person, I'm slightly soft-spoken, although I know a lot of my students will disagree with me vehemently and probably post about it on siberXchange. I'm not marking any courses this semester, so I can't fail you, but that's fine. But Sarah, how now with these new devices that are around us, how do you now manage to ensure that a business can continue, but also remain compliant and also remain secure? New hardware, new requirements are bringing new challenges. Your thoughts?
Right. So the challenge isn't new. We've been very aware of all the IoT devices that are going to be all plugged in and talking to each other at the most optimal level. And the industry, the security industry, has been raising awareness about this for a long time, that we are going to one day connect unlimited number of devices that we are not going to secure first. And all of a sudden, we are going to have a whole bunch of new hardware married to brand new software that hasn't gone through rigorous security testing be on the internet. That is where we are today, to be honest. There's a lot of unsafe, unsecured endpoints on the internet. So the situation doesn't change, but it amplifies itself. So that's where we are. So if we can prepare for the current state, but in an amplified manner, we would essentially be preparing proactively for where the where the world is going. We're not going to be able to stop all these devices from being connected to the internet. So don't even think about preventing any connection of new devices.
Right.
Be with the wave of technology, understand it, accept it, and move with the advancement of technology. Digital transformation for every single business is key to survive, and they've done it. Now, if we as an industry focus, like I'm speaking on behalf of the industry in this context, only from cybersecurity perspective, if we can emphasize more and more of how to secure a device before you connect it to the internet, that is the right mindset. But we're not going to get enough time to do that because businesses that are ready with infrastructure and IoT devices are not going to go submit an application somewhere to say, hey, can somebody come and tell us if we're fully secure to be connected to the internet?
Right.
It's just going to happen. It's just going to explode.
Yep. And I think this aspect of what you mentioned about going out into the public, talking to other folks, seeing what other organizations are doing and adopting practices represents one of the other roadblocks that I'm going to get to. So we'll take a pause on the hardware piece ever so slightly, but we'll come back to that. We have about 20 minutes left, and we'll come back to that. Michael, I know that we mentioned earlier on that you've been dealing with not just large organizations, but also smaller organizations as well. That takes me to the next roadblock. I know we discussed hardware has its challenges, and as I said earlier on, these are checkpoints for us, and we've discussed some great strategies by which we can pass these checkpoints and move beyond these roadblocks. But from a financial standpoint, large organizations and small organizations are impacted differently. I've often said this, that cash gets you the tools, but commitment gets you the process. Commitment gets you the product. How at this point, whether it's small or large businesses, how do you sort of get them to allocate funds for the right business continuity practices? A, you need to get buy-in from not just the finance folks, but other departments. B, a divestment of funds in some cases and a reinvestment in other areas. How do you create the financial spending priorities for a business continuity plan?
Definitely, you're right, Ali. The differences between large organizations and small ones is very, very vast. Large organization, obviously with bigger budgets and bigger room to do things, can allocate budgets, can allocate capabilities and even resources for something that may not be needed for day-to-day revenue generation or operational benefit.
Fair.
But you look down towards smaller, mid-sized businesses where every person within an organization, every aspect of every machine is being used at every moment to be able to do things. There isn't a lot of extra or excess or people on the bench to be able to do things. So it's very difficult to convince or have a conversation with leaders in smaller organizations to tell them to prepare for a rainy day, to build this capability model to have them more prepared. Because the prioritization isn't there, right? Their prioritization is being able to get through day by day and, being able to survive for another day and being able to continue to work. So it is a bit of a different conversation. I think with those SMBs and those smaller organizations, a lot of it has to do with putting a little bit aside or thinking of the how could we do it, given that we don't have, these other capabilities or resources beside us. What could we do? What could be a means? And that could be, relying on a third party. That could be, ramping up capabilities. That could be some cloud solutioning, but something that still needs a bit of planning, maybe not some outlay of the funds in advance, but some planning in advance that at least gives them a path towards, being able to accomplish something in a situation where a BCP has to be enacted.
Now let's take that aspect of third party, and thank you for that really rich insight, Michael. You mentioned third party, and that necessarily gets me to my point, which has always been that businesses don't operate in a vacuum. Yes, we compete, but we also collaborate. Even we collaborate with our competitors as well. And at times like this, you've seen industries come together, and if I may sound amateur when I say it, play nice and play ball with one another because we're all struggling and suffering in our own unique ways. I know that we have a lot of folks from the public sector, especially counselors and government officials that are listening to us, and I think I want to bring them into this context of business continuity. Now, I did say this in my Power Hour with Marilyn Crawford, who is a counselor at the town of Ajax that, great ideas and nations are built in the hearts of poets and entrepreneurs, and they come to die in the hands of politicians, simply because a lot of them are stuck with these notions around how do you just remain within the bureaucratic norms, how do you just keep status quo. There's often that image of our political context. But today, and this is a question that I'm just going to rephrase that I'm getting, today, we're relying a lot on our chambers of commerce. We're relying a lot on our local municipalities to come in and help and assist both financially and operationally. Initiatives like Digital Main Street is a very good example. City of Brampton, that's one of our sponsors and supporters of siberXchange, they do a lot of stuff for their business communities, from freight and getting more discounts out there and being able to access more services, whatever e-commerce platforms, whatever have you. Sarah, let's start with you, then we'll go to Janet, and then sort of have a soft landing with Michael. Do you think government has a role in shaping business continuity plans of organizations?
I love this opportunity to put some onus on the government to say absolutely they do. Absolutely. Any CISO anywhere in the world will tell you allocation of funds to a security program is a challenge we've all experienced. Traditionally, money is given to IT, and security gets a cut based on a percentage, and it keeps increasing. And now we realize that, no, you got to look at cybersecurity separately. You can't look at it as a subset of IT. It is something that needs to live on its own. However, municipalities and the government, federal government, municipalities, even the provincial government, have a very strong responsibility, high responsibility, to take it into account that now the businesses need assistance to work, not for how things were in the past, not to go back to normal, but to a future state, which we are figuring out as we go along. That what does a business need to be successful for the future state of things? So we can't really strive on let's reset and go back to normal, because there's no such thing. We've got to prepare and understand and actually proactively think, how is the world changing? What does a business need? And then the government have the responsibility to think along businesses and assist businesses in being progressive and productive for the future state.
And I think this is so emblematic of a thought process that Jason from Palo Alto was talking about, is that often the worry is in the moment of an emergency is, hey, let's just get the lights on and we'll figure out security and everything else later on. And I think that time continuum of later on is where all of these attacks and new threats start to emerge from. A wonderful example of this is this idea of how we do take temperatures willy-nilly wherever people are. Kat Koot pointed out that the temperature that when she was going into a particular store, I was appalled that they didn't know who Kat Koot was and didn't just let her in, but that's a separate discussion altogether. But what they did was they took her temperature, and I don't say that this was done maliciously, right in the middle of a hall. Now, multiple people can see what her temperature potentially is, and if she gets rejected, multiple people can now see that she got rejected, possibly because she's exhibiting symptoms, and it creates a new threat. It creates a new environment where you feel unsafe. So we have to think about security not as an add-on, but as you mentioned, by design to everything that we are doing, which takes me now back to Janet. And Janet, I can say this, I got my Canadian citizenship, so I feel secure that if I hit down on the government a little bit, it'll be well respected. I don't mean it sort of maliciously, but I mean it to sort of shed light on this aspect of, do you really feel that many of the conversations we're getting from not just our chambers of commerce, they're all well-intentioned, but from various levels of government, that they truly understand what the new risks are that we're about to get into? Do you feel that the conversation is mature, or has it not even started because everybody's worried about how do I just keep the lights on? Janet?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I really agree with all that Sarah has mentioned. The government definitely plays a big aspect on how we're going to continue on with this COVID-19 aspect. Whether or not they're mature in their conversation, I would say that they're getting there. I won't say it's 100% because it's a continuing learning process. There's no way we can be 100% sure this is the right solution to go next. You don't know that. But the conversation has definitely already started. It has to be. And it's going to continue to go on to be more mature as days go on. And the government has every aspect of helping every single business in order to get our economy back up. As everybody know, the economy is up and down right now. And it's really the government, we need the government's help in order to get us past that. And how we're going to do that is to continue those conversations, continue those risk assessment and planning in order to foresee the future state, what it's going to be like. We might not know 100%, we might not know the 100% the solution of it, but getting toward that way, getting toward the future state, and how we're going to help these small businesses. I think that's the most impact right now.
Yep.
Many of the small businesses are not able to keep afloat. What's the government doing to help them that?
Yep.
And that I think is really starts from the government, because there's nobody else can really reach out to. So really the government needs to come and help out and get out to that mature state and daily discussions and keep the conversation going.
I agree with you. And you mentioned small to medium businesses, and I'll come to Michael with this. And Michael, there's often this feeling, right, that right now what everybody needs in this, or small businesses specifically, is just an IV drip of cash, and they'll suddenly just come back to full health, and it's like nothing happened. But that's not necessarily true. It's not just about writing that check. It's about programs. Rephrasing a question that we have here, Michael, do you think now is the right time, speaking about finances as a roadblock, but also financial thinking and investment thinking as a roadblock, now is the right time for our governments to be looking at how can we centralize security services for our small to medium businesses? Because as Sarah alluded to, not many of the small businesses can afford to have a business continuity dedicated person, can afford to have a CISO. And that's not to say that, CISOs are highly, highly priced. That's not a conversation that I'm trying to get into. But the reality is that you have a lot of responsibility that you have to wear on your shoulders, and that comes at a price because you are walking that plank. Is now the right time to look at a centralized environment or a sort of a consortia for small to medium businesses and cybersecurity led by the government? Michael?
Ali, I think that's a great idea. I mean, the government has shown in the last few months, aside from, cutting checks for individuals within, Canada and in many other countries, but, have, banded together at various levels to be able to bring e-commerce to the masses, to be able to help the small companies have web design and get themselves online, to be able to have a new medium that they weren't necessarily able to do or didn't know how to do before. I think security is one of those areas, and I see that with the clients that I talk to, it's one of those areas that, is often an afterthought, or it's too big of an unknown, that they just don't know where to go or know how to tackle it. And, you're right, it potentially has a cost that is associated with it. I think the government has an opportunity to help beyond just a website with tips on how to stay cyber safe, or to, help your kids not, fall prey on social media. I think the government has an opportunity to bring together knowledge, to bring together capabilities and a model that would allow small businesses to tap into capabilities and tap into services that can be set up and created specifically for small, medium businesses to help them overcome. And, much like anything, there's always a cost associated with it. But I think having one banded group help bring those together, a small company in Vancouver can, help or get help from a cyber organization that is based in South America or on the East Coast of Canada or in Europe. There are means that, today they might not have, that a government interaction and a government program might be able to bring together. So I think there's a lot of value there. It's about helping the masses. The more organizations that we can bring together, and in Canada, of course, small businesses are a major part of our economy. The more that we can bring together to be able to tackle cyber and have a part of the solution, it's the better off for everybody.
And I think that aspect of sharing, and that's very key to what the siberXchange platform is about. And I think that also informed your decisions in terms of joining the advisory. And that was primarily because of the fact that when you looked at it, you had folks, of course, from North America, but we have had folks from Pakistan, we've had folks from India, from Australia, from Brazil. And I think that learning that happens is very, very important. And to your point earlier on is that sometimes it may just sound very simple to say it, but for the government to be able to create connectivity, not just physical, but social, with different companies and different businesses, allowing you to leverage different solutions and investing in that, seeing what's possible, could be a good way to go forward. There is a lot of difficulty with putting together consortia and putting together think tanks that have to run centralized services. But of course, I think the conversation like Janet alluded to, needs to happen and needs to continue to mature. We've got another 2 or 3 minutes, and I want to take on one more question. I think we've all understood that, we all agree that people can be a necessary roadblock. We agree that hardware is another necessary roadblock, and finances, another necessary roadblock. But what you've done so well is to sort of show us how you can get through all of this. And there are others that come along in the journey as well. But if you understand the people, you understand the technology, and you understand the process, you're sort of in the right way and you're moving down the right path with an ability to go back if needed. Let's take one more question, and that is this aspect of the benevolent big fours or big fives in technology that always come with a framework for business continuity. Do you subscribe to any of these, or do you prepare your own sort of playbook to work with? This question goes for all of you. We'll start off with Sarah. Sarah, a couple of seconds to you.
So in cybersecurity, not a single framework is prescriptive to the extent that you take the framework and you plug and play. I always have to take multiple frameworks. Yep. Yes, you can aspire to be compliant with one particular standard, but all the frameworks are guidelines. Yep. So you have to remember that. Even if there was one single BCP framework that everybody was singing its praises, you would still have to customize the implementation of it. So a framework, just leave it as a framework, and it's great, but you have to bring in the business context, you have to bring in the risk that you're mitigating, and then you have to work with the framework to say, okay, now this is utilized, and now it's helpful. So that's my view on the framework, but there isn't a single prescriptive framework in cybersecurity to implement business continuity today.
Timing is at the core of what you just said. Thank you for that, Sarah. Janet, some closing comments to you on frameworks for BCP.
Yeah, I have to agree with Sarah as well. There is not just one common framework you should just stick with. You need a variety of framework. And I really think it's a continuous journey in planning a business continuity plan. Some folks may think it's just a once a year thing, but honestly, if there's any process that's been changed, any new hardware, software that's added, you need to think about your business continuity again. Anytime there's a change in something, you need to think about how you're going to plan your business continuity on the business side aspect to the technology side, and continue your risk assessment. And I really think that it's a continuous journey process, and you need to consider that some folks may be a daily basis until you get to a part to the level that you want, to quarterly, to monthly, to yearly, depending on the situation. But definitely a continuous planning is involved, daily conversation, and continue to raise the awareness to all your employees.
Sarah's framework is time sensitive, yours is context specific. Castro, what are your ingredients to a successful BCP framework? Closing statements.
Yeah, I think it's everything that we've said. It definitely comes with a core. We have to look at what that core is and how that, we grow from that, but on top of that, though, there has to be some customization. Every organization is different. There's no black and white. We can't even take organizations in the same industries and be able to plant one model or framework to go on it. But to me, it's a lot like first aid and learning first aid. You learn those basics, you learn how to stop bleeding, but a lot of it is common sense. And it's that common sense of really understanding what you truly need to do, that gut feeling, and really understanding the basics that really help organizations when married together with the uniqueness that they have, and married together with those broad pieces of the framework, or those pivotal pieces. Bring it all together, and it leads you down the path of success for each organization.
Sarah, Janet, Michael, as always, it's a pleasure to host you. It's a pleasure to engage with you. And jokes apart, it's always important for myself as an instructor, as a professor, as a member of a growing tech community here in Durham region, to learn from these, because a lot of our companies in our communities have suffered. We've seen a lot of companies go down. And really, what's been important is that you've not only given insight to tech-based firms, you've also had insight here for restaurants. You've had insights here for small operations and how they can think of business continuity. For our audience, what I will say is that these members of our advisory exchange are not just members of our advisory, they are friends to our community, and they're folks who you can reach out to on siberXchange.ca. One of the most fundamental things that you would have heard from them is this aspect of, they call it business continuity as opposed to business contingency. And that is simply because When you're thinking business continuity, you're thinking, how can I continue our operations in a seamless fashion? The environment may be different, but we are delivering the same value. How do you do it seamlessly? How do you do it collaboratively? And more importantly, how do you do it continuously as opposed to contingently? Two fundamental words that make a world of a difference between companies that are able to survive and companies that are able to exist in the new normal. Sarah, Janet, and Michael, thank you all for your time. I know you will be in other sessions during the week. I bid you adieu, and I look forward to seeing you in further sessions, as well as online on www.siberXchange.ca. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and to the community watching online, we'll see you in the next half an hour for the next session, which will continue along this train of thought around business continuity. Thank you so much.